The Nazi regime lasted from 1933 to 1945 and was undoubtedly one of the most horrific periods of history.
To begin to understand Hitler, you've really got to understand that he was the most amazing demagogue.
The Nazi Party and its immoral leader instilled one of the most corrupt regimes on the people of Germany and its invisible enemies. However, Adolf Hitler was not working alone.
It's the SS men doing not only the exterminations and are notorious for being some of the most evil and deadly troops.
He had a circle of some of the most barbaric and evil men alongside him, who helped make the atrocities possible.
If there were unpleasant things going on or policies that they didn't like, then somehow that Hitler couldn't know about it, that he wasn't associated with it, it can't have been him. If only the Fuhrer knew, this wouldn't be happening.
These are the Nazi fugitives. Adolf Hitler was a German politician and leader of the Nazi Party. He rose to power as the Chancellor of Germany in 1933, and then as Führer in 1934. During his dictatorship from 1933 to 1945, he initiated World War II in Europe by invading Poland on the 1st of September 1939.
Extremist politics thrives on chaos, poverty, destitution, and want. And what you see as a result of the Wall Street crash and the slump, the late 20s, early 30s, are all those things in this hideous cocktail that an extremist like Hitler, he's saying, I can solve this.
Some of the important ways in which he helped the party to develop was through the initiation of a newspaper, so a party newspaper called the Volkische Beobachter, the People's Observer.
And also what Hitler is absolutely amazing at is speech making. And to begin to understand Hitler, you've really got to understand that he was the most amazing demagogue. He got on that stage, this little man, and he would sort of grow in stature. He would sort of absolutely take over the entire beer hall with his presence. He would shout and he'd get quiet and he would almost enter into a kind of trance. And the audiences would be mesmerized by this. And indeed, they'd be mesmerized by it for decades. And this is key to how Hitler gets into power, because when he's on the stage, he becomes another figure.
On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, but of a coalition government. So there were just 3 Nazi posts in that coalition government.
It's very tempting to think that when Hitler comes to power in early 1933, that his grip on power is absolutely total. In fact, he has a very uneven, shaky start. He's still quite worried about public opinion. So what he does is a mixture of passing various laws that give him more and more power, like the Enabling Act, that actually makes him immensely powerful. But also, he takes advantage of various events like the Reichstag fire, in which the German Parliament building burns down. Now, it's highly likely, but never proven, whether the Nazis actually burnt it down themselves. But certainly, in a sense, it doesn't matter. What happens is that Hitler and the Nazis took advantage of the Reichstag burning down to show that there was a communist plot against what the Nazis described as still being a democratic government. And it enabled them to seize more power, by emergency decree.
Very quickly, he turned Germany into a one-party state. So first of all, he made sure to eliminate the influence and power of the German political left, so the Socialist Party and the Communist Party for a start, were banned, but over a short amount of time as well, the Nazi Party was the only legal party too.
Eventually, in January 33, he becomes Chancellor. Now, don't forget, Chancellor in Germany, and this still remains today, is not, at the time, the head of state. The head of state is the president. So it's the Chancellor, though, who has the real executive power. In order to take as much power as he can, he's also going to have to make himself head of state. And that really becomes an opportunity for him when Hindenburg dies, and he's able to take on the role of both president and chancellor and kind of create this new role for himself, and that is the role of Führer, the German word for leader. That is a fascist term, be in no doubt. This is a kind of new form of governance that Germany now has. Other parties are banned. The only party allowed is the Nazi Party. This has become a totalitarian state, and Hitler can say to the German people, you voted for it. It's a con, and it's a con that worked.
Pageantry, the district leaders from all over Germany swore personal allegiance to him, hypnotized with the belief that they were members of a master race. This film will deal with Act One of the Nazi bid for world power, the most fantastic play in all recorded history.
Hitler starts to build up his power by, trying to employ and find the right people who are going to listen to the beat of his drum and follow it. And so there's a lot of very patient politicking and a lot of persuasion, a lot of speech making. It's a very, very difficult rise to power. But Hitler knows that it can't take place through force. It has to take place from the ballot box and not the bullet.
Paul Joseph Goebbels was a German Nazi politician and Reich Minister of Propaganda of Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945. He was one of Adolf Hitler's closest and most devoted associates. He was known for his skills in public speaking and his deeply virulent anti-Semitism, which was evident in his publicly voiced views. In May 1933, Goebbels arranged the burning of all un-German books at the Opera House in Berlin, indicating that the Nazis were taking control of everything. He gained control of the media entirely, controlling all aspects of the press, radio, theatres, films and television, literature, music and the fine arts. Josef Goebbels and his wife Magda are seen as the perfect German family to set an example for the German people.
Josef Goebbels joined the Nazi Party quite early on, as did Hitler, and he became very much involved in those early years with helping the party to develop, and in particular with these techniques of propaganda and really getting these messages across to the German nation. Part of the way that he and Hitler did this was to use very short slogans, but to keep repeating them so that everybody knew what the Nazi Party was about.
He is married to a very sort of striking blonde woman called Magda. Now, Magda has been married before to a very wealthy German industrialist, but she eventually gets divorced and marries Joseph Goebbels, who was a real Casanova, actually. Even though he was short, club-footed, and not an attractive man, he had a lot of sexual conquests. What you see in the marriage of Joseph Goebbels and Magda is a three-way, not in bed, but emotionally between those two and Adolf Hitler. Because Adolf Hitler absolutely adored Magda Goebbels and thought that she was the kind of perfect Nazi woman. And she was blonde and she was, sort of vivacious, And she was absolutely devoted to Hitler. She absolutely adored him.
Magda was very good for the Nazi Party, and when Goebbels introduced her to Hitler, Hitler got on very well with her and sort of could see the advantages and encouraged them to get married. Part of the reason for that was that she was very well bred and very refined and elegant. She was the mother of the Reich because she had 6 children.
Hitler liked the Goebbels marriage as a kind of domestic situation he could drop in and out of. Okay? He liked the security that involved children running around, boats on lakes, it felt normal. And also Hitler did not want to have any rumours about his relationship with Magda Goebbels, because there were rumours that he had fathered some of the Goebbels' children, and that had seen even a very senior Nazi sent to a concentration camp for actually mentioning that.
Hitler and Joseph Goebbels had sort of grown through the ranks of the Nazi Party and sort of succeeded, sort of made their rise to success together. When Hitler came to power, Goebbels was somehow overlooked for a cabinet position. We said there were just 3, he didn't get any of them. Nevertheless, after the Nazis took power, that seizure of power, he orchestrated a very big torchlight parade, a kind of victory parade for the new movement. He knew how to get the message across to the Germans. So once he was the Minister of Propaganda, first of all, there was censorship of the press, but also not just controlling the press, but he controlled all aspects of cultural life. So that was art, architecture, literature, music. Propaganda machine was very, very important to the whole story that the Third Reich was telling, and indeed right up until the end, and indeed even important once the tide of the war turned against Germany. There was still this need to maintain the storyline, to maintain what the Third Reich represented.
So you have essentially Goebbels, heart of the Third Reich, propaganda minister, getting word out there. Magda Goebbels, his wife, who is more devoted to Hitler than to him, and then you've got Goebbels, who's probably more devoted to Hitler than he is to his own wife. And if you want to see the ultimate expression of this twisted, bizarre, dark, horrific love, if you like, it's the fact that they both kill themselves to follow Hitler into the afterlife, and they kill their own children in the bunker, poison all 6 children, because a world without Hitler and a world without Nazism is no place for their kids. That's how much they adored Hitler.
Heinrich Himmler was Reichsführer of the Schutzstaffel and a leading member of the Nazi Party of Germany. Himmler was considered one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany and a leading architect of the Holocaust. Heinrich Himmler established his force of elite bodyguards for Hitler, the SS. Himmler established the first Nazi concentration camp in Dachau, indicating he had no issue bringing harm to Jews, as he considered them vermin within Germany.
Himmler, like Hitler, looked like the very inverse of the kind of Aryan, blonde, 6'5" tall superhuman. He was a very short man, sort of weak jawline, very ugly, sort of pebble glasses, former chicken farmer. He looked very, very unimpressive.
Himmler had joined the Nazi Party in quite early years, and I think that the important thing about what Himmler did was that he established the SS. And the SS started out as a very small group, and in fact started out as Hitler's personal bodyguard. Himmler extended his power very quickly and his power base. So with the SS as a very small organization that had started out as Hitler's bodyguard, suddenly became thousands strong. By about 1936, he was in charge of a very vast complex of the SS, the Gestapo, which was the secret police, and the security police.
And what Himmler does from, almost from the beginning is to build the SS up into a state within a state. Because by the height of Nazi power, Himmler is in charge of an organization that has a kind of civil side to it, an administrative side to it, which is huge and has fingers in so many pies, and also the Waffen-SS, the armed SS, which is there, to help fight the war. And its troops are notorious for being some of the most sort of kind of evil and deadly troops, as part of the war.
He became in charge of the whole concentration camp system.
He was responsible for the Holocaust because, it was the SS largely who carried it out. And when he went to go and kind of witness a slaughter, some brains were splattered upon his coat and it caused him to vomit. He never, this is the man responsible for it and he can't cope with it. I'm not saying it's desirable that he should have coped with it, but it just shows you that he didn't actually have the personal appetite for butchering people himself and got other people to do it. In many ways, he was a coward.
Hermann Wilhelm Göring was a German politician and military leader and later a convicted war criminal. Göring was one of the most influential figures in the Nazi Party. He was also framed in a scandal, claiming he was attempting to take over the Führer's powers in the war's final days. Göring wrote a letter to Hitler, offering to relieve Hitler of his duties and act in his place, as he had believed the Führer was encircled and helpless in Berlin. This was a reasonable act, as Hitler had named him the political heir. Hitler issued a telegram to Göring and told him he had committed high treason and gave him the option to resign his office in exchange for his life.
Hermann Göring is a really key Nazi figure. He's a big figure in every way because he also became enormously fat. But you've got to think of Göring and his kind of arc, if you like. So he goes from being a First World War fighter pilot hero who's got the Pour le Mérite medal, which is the highest medal that can be won by the German fighting man in the First World War. For the British, it's like winning the Victoria Cross, or for the Americans, it's like winning the kind of Medal of Honor. It's a hugely important award. And so he's a venerated pilot, very successful fighter pilot during the First World War. And then when he falls in with the Nazis in Munich in the 20s, he's feeling that's giving him a kind of sense of purpose.
Göring was quite an interesting character because he had several different roles in the Third Reich, and even before then, if we think about his First World War record as this sort of flying ace, it meant that later on Hitler made him head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force.
The problem is that he's on the famous beer hall putsch in 1923 and he gets shot and wounded. And when he's recuperating from his wounds, he's given morphine, heroin, effectively. And it's that he becomes addicted to. Göring is addicted to morphine all the way through from the beer hall putsch in 23, for another 23 years until he dies in 1946. It holds him back in many ways, but he is a man who likes the finest things in life. And so when the Nazis do come to power, and that's partly thanks to the fact that Göring is such a capable politician, and because he comes from a pretty well-off background and married to an aristocrat, he to some of the kind of old-school German bigwigs looks like the decent face of Nazism because he's kind of a war hero and quite an old-school figure. So he's absolutely instrumental in helping the Nazis get into power. And he consolidates a lot of power into his own pockets and hands, if you like. So he's in charge of the Prussian police. He's initially in charge of the Gestapo, the secret state police. He's in charge of the 4-year plan, which is an important economic imperative. This is a man with a lot of power, and he uses it to personally enrich himself. When you look at pictures of Goering throughout the war, you just see this body getting bigger, bigger and bigger, and his uniforms getting more and more ostentatious. And he had like millions of medals everywhere, and the uniforms would be like bright white with gold all over them. And he would have properties, amazing hunting lodges. He loved hunting, and whenever the Nazis conquered countries, he'd be right at the front of it, looting all the works of art, statues, paintings, jewelry, you name it, that would all go into Goering's pocket. He made himself almost impossibly rich, and he also had vast appetites, not only for morphine, but also for alcohol, for food, you know, for all the finest things in life. And in fact, he became a victim of his own self-indulgence. And when the Battle of Britain failed, and when the German Air Force was shown to be, you know, inferior to a smaller British Air Force, he started, you know, to be laughed at behind his back. You know, he became this kind of drug-addled, alcoholic whale of a man who other Nazis would laugh at and not take seriously and saw him as an impediment. By the end of the war, he's this joke figure. And it's at Nuremberg, when he's off the drugs, when he loses weight, his brain suddenly gets sharper again. And of all the Nazis in the dock at Nuremberg, he's the most impressive. And that old flash of intelligence and brilliance that's got him to the top of the Nazi tree is shown once more. And it's Goering who cheats the hangman by committing suicide in his cell in 1946. Does he get the last laugh? In some ways, he does.
Rudolph Franz Ferdinand Hess was a German Schutzstaffel functionary during the Nazi era who was later convicted as a war criminal. He was the longest-serving commandant of the Auschwitz concentration and extermination camp. He tested and implemented means to accelerate Hitler's plan to exterminate the Jewish population systematically and introduce Zyklon B, containing hydrogen cyanide, used in the gas chambers.
Now, he was the commandant of Auschwitz, and as a result, has, you know, probably got about 1 million people, you know, against his name who he had murdered.
He typified the quiet and bureaucratic mass murderer, very conscientious, very determined to do his job and to do it well, and of course without much thought for the victims. So in terms of what he was doing at Auschwitz, trying to make a very efficient machine and trying to do his job well and properly, his concern was not with the victims, but just to make sure that the apparatus was working well. So in this case, to ensure that the gas chambers could operate efficiently. He treated the mass murder that went on there just as a kind of routine and ordinary business as usual, really, very much as a kind of ordinary procedure and process. He took pride in being the first to use Zyklon B as the gas used for the gassing of his victims, and he was so efficient that at Auschwitz 2.5 million prisoners met their death. So it's a massive death toll, 2.5 million deaths at Auschwitz.
He went into hiding at the end of the war on the advice of Heinrich Himmler, his ultimate boss in the SS, and Hess disguises himself and hides amongst various German Navy personnel. He's eventually picked up by the British, who've actually interrogated his wife, who's actually terrified that she's going to be tortured by the Brits, and she's basically spilled the beans. So Hess is brought to justice. And there is this extraordinary image of a British war crimes officer actually confronting Hess, who looks like this completely pathetic figure, you know, looking absolutely terrified while this sort of tall British army officer is just basically shouting at him. And it shows, you know, basically this man who had power of life and death over millions of people is reduced to this pathetic figure. Now the British hand him over to the Poles, and it's the Poles who actually bring him to justice, and it's the Poles who hang him.
We had 2 SS doctors on duty at Auschwitz to examine the incoming transports of prisoners. Prisoners would be marched past one of the doctors who would make spot decisions as they walked by. Those who were fit for work were sent into the camp. Others were sent immediately to the extermination plant. Children of tender years were invariably exterminated, since by reason of their youth they were unable to work. We endeavored to fool them into thinking they were to go through a delousing process. It took from 3 to 15 minutes to kill the people in the death chamber, depending upon climatic conditions. We knew when the people were dead because their screaming stopped. We usually waited about 1/2 hour before we opened the doors and removed the bodies. After the bodies were removed, our special commandos took off the rings and extracted the gold from the teeth of the corpses.
He was brought before a Polish military tribunal and he was found guilty and he was executed in April 1947. He was taken back to Auschwitz to outside the house where he and his family had lived, and he was executed there. He was executed there at the place where he had lived and at the place where he had sent millions of people to die during his time as commandant at Auschwitz.
Otto Adolf Eichmann was a German-Austrian SS Obersturmbannführer and one of the major organizers of the Holocaust, the final solution to the Jewish question in Nazi terminology. Eichmann quickly became known as the world's most wanted Nazi, branded the architect of the final solution to exterminate Jews. He was seen as the mastermind behind the network of death camps that resulted in the murder of approximately 6 million people. He orchestrated the identification, assembly, and transportation of European Jews to Auschwitz, Treblinka, and other death camps in Poland.
Adolf Eichmann was in charge of the Office for Jewish Emigration in Vienna, first of all, so he kind of sort of rose to a prominent position after the Anschluss in 1938, and essentially he was responsible for the forced removal or relocation of first Vienna's and then the rest of Austria's Jews, and then of course for the forced removal of all of the European Jews who were under Nazi rule as the years went on.
Eichmann today is an incredibly notorious name, and we all today know him to be the man he was. He's famously and notoriously called the architect of the final solution. What he was in charge of a department of the Reich Security Main Office, and it was called Department 4B4. It was part of the Gestapo, the secret state police, and his job was to basically wage war against the Jews. And it was Eichmann's job was to help facilitate the destruction of the Jewish people.
He was responsible for registering, assembling, and then transporting the Jews from different assembly points to the death camps in Poland. In December 1939, he sort of took on a more important or kind of bigger role within the Gestapo as head of the Jewish office of the Reich Main Security Office. And so again, the main point of that role really was to orchestrate and carry out the removal of all of the European Jews to the death camps in Poland.
He was effectively the guy, didn't come up with the policy, but he was the guy who zealously implemented it. And he knew that if he was captured, he would face the noose.
Eichmann was arrested at the end of the war, but his name wasn't very well known at that stage. He managed to escape from an American internment camp in 1946.
He decided to call himself Ekman, and then he managed to, go into hiding for quite a few years in Germany on farms, and he tried to sort of recreate his life as a kind of humble son of the soil, if you like. But actually, by the late 1940s, he realizes that things are getting a bit hot. He suspects that war crimes units may be after him. And what he does is that he eventually flees to Argentina, where he tries to create a new life.
Eventually, in 1960, the Israeli secret services after quite a lot of detective work, managed to find him. And then came into place an operation really to smuggle him out of Argentina and to bring him to Israel in order to stand trial.
Behind this fence, the pages of history are being turned back to one of the most terrible chapters of our time. Adolf Eichmann faces probably the most appalling list of charges ever to be leveled against a single human being. But if Eichmann's is the name on the charge sheet, the Israelis have made very clear who they think is really in the dock. In the building where Eichmann is being tried, the Israelis are trying to place before the conscience of the world the full facts of how the Nazis in Germany tried literally to exterminate millions of the Jewish people in Europe. Now, to us, the Nazi persecution is 15 years or more away. But to the people living here, it's still a sharp memory. The children playing in the warm spring sunshine, the older people going about their everyday lives. Many of them had relatives who died in Hitler's gas ovens. And even here in Israel, they found no peaceful haven. Just over a mile up the road from here, there's a barbed wire fence, and sentries stand guard. This is the border across which Israel looks to an implacably hostile Arab neighbor. To the people of Israel, persecution, personified by Eichmann, is still a living danger. For now, in this city of Jerusalem, which itself is no stranger to history, let us look back at the moment when this historic trial began.
In Jerusalem, the trial of Adolf Eichmann begins, reviving memories of the Nazi horrors of the Second World War. Entering the bulletproof prisoner's box is the man charged with the annihilation of millions of Jews in Nazi death camps. Searching problems of conscience and of international law will be raised by this trial, one of the most stirring of modern times. Eichmann himself is impassive, as the three judges who will decide his fate enter. Now, after 15 years in hiding, and 1 year after his sensational abduction from Argentina, Adolf Eichmann is indicted on 15 counts of crimes against the Jewish people and crimes against humanity.
Accused, together with others, during the period 1939 to 1945, caused the killing of millions of Jews in his capacity as the person responsible for the execution of the Nazi plan for the physical extermination of the Jews, known as the final solution of the Jewish problem.
Eichmann's attorney, Dr. Robert Servatius, opens by denying the legality of the trial and questions the jurisdiction obtained by Eichmann's forcible capture. Dr. Servatius further suggests that Eichmann be tried by a neutral or international tribunal. Israeli Attorney General Gideon Hausner, the chief prosecutor, replies that no one except the State of Israel has sought to bring Eichmann to justice, and cites the Nuremberg war crimes trials as precedent for this trial. Throughout, Eichmann remains icy calm, his fate at last in the scales of justice.
The trial, which opened in April 1961, was very controversial, but it also, of course, attracted a great deal of international attention as well. When he was questioned, he claimed that he was only following orders. He claimed not to be responsible for any of the executions and said he was just involved in transportation. So again, that's the kind of line used about following orders and not really admitting responsibility for the final solution.
Yes. With regard to the Jews, my only obligations were those concerned with emigration, and this transpires from the official designation of the department, which was called emigration and evacuation. Emigration, that applied to the Jews, while evacuation, that concerned the sphere of jurisdiction of the Reichskommissar for strengthening the basis of the German nation, a post to which Himmler was then appointed. And this concerned the evacuation of the newly annexed areas in the east, which were annexed to the Reich. And as Hitler and Himmler had ordered at that time, these areas had to be evacuated of Jews and other foreign nationalities. And my connection with this was strictly from the point of view of timetables and technical transport problems.
Im Einzelnen ist mir diese Sache heute nicht mehr gegenwärtig, Herr Präsident, aber ich weiß, dass die Herren beisammengesessen sind und haben hier eben in sehr unverblümten Worten, nicht in den Worten, wie ich sie dann ins Protokoll geben musste, sondern in sehr unverblümten Worten die Sache genannt, wie sie eben, ohne sie zu umschreiben.
I do not remember it in detail, Your Honor. I do not remember the circumstances of this conversation, but I do know that these gentlemen were standing together or sitting together and were discussing this subject quite bluntly, quite differently from the language which I had to use later in the record. During the conversation, they minced no words about it at all.
Wenn ich nicht wüsste, dass ich mir damals gesagt hätte, schau, der Stuckart, den man immer als einen sehr genauen und sehr heiklen Gesetzesonkel betrachtete. Und da hier war eben der Ton und die ganzen Formulierungen waren hier sehr unparagraphenmäßig gewesen. Das ist das Einzige, möchte ich sagen, das mir noch effektiv dieserhalb im Gedächtnis haften geblieben ist.
I might say furthermore, Your Honor, that I would not have remembered this unless I had later remembered that I told myself, look here, I told myself, even this guy Stuckart, who was known as one of these uncles who was a great stickler for legalities, he too uses language which is not at all in accordance with the spirit of paragraphs of the law. This incident remained engraved in my memory and recalls the entire subject to my mind.
Eichmann was sentenced to death in December 1961, and he was executed in May 1962.
Rudolph Vter Hes was a German politician and a leading member of the Nazi Party in Nazi Germany. Appointed deputy Führer to Adolf Hitler in 1933, Hess served in that position until 1941, when he flew solo to Scotland in an attempt to negotiate peace with the United Kingdom during World War II. Rudolph Hess noticed that the Führer was preoccupied and decided to take matters into his own hands. He decided to end the continuing military struggle between Germany and the Allies using a peace pact. He secretly flies solo over Britain and lands in Scotland by parachute, hoping to speak with one of the highly placed British figures. He intended to offer respect for the integrity of the British Empire, for Germany to have a free hand in Europe and the return of German colonies. Of course, as soon as he was found out to be a Nazi, he was arrested and treated as a prisoner of war, held in a British prison until the war's end. Once Hitler hears of his plan and capture in Britain, he declares Hess has committed treason, and the Nazis reject him.
Rudolf Hess was a very troubled man in many ways, and you only have to look at his somewhat uneven expressions whenever he's captured on film. He's got his very sort of thick brows, and he looks like he's puzzling about the world in general. He was a very sort of troubled man, and he was devoted to Hitler from the very early days. And it was Hess who was in Landsberg prison after the failed beer hall putsch in 1923, and it was Hess who was by kind of Hitler's side, you know, all the way through those sort of kind of very dark years. You know, as Hitler gains more power, Hitler is loyal to Hess because Hess has been loyal to him, and he makes him deputy Führer. But it's clear that as the Nazi Party has come to power and its popularity and its ability to draw on talent has increased, it's basically shown up Hess to be the kind of real second or third rater that he actually is. He's not really a very impressive figure. You know, what does he offer, you know, the Nazi regime now to control? He doesn't have any great personal charisma that's going to draw people in. He doesn't really have any particular kind of administrative skills. He doesn't, you know, what he is just loyal. He's kind of totally out of his depth by the time Hitler comes into power. His usefulness is no longer there, and he's really basically very much sidelined by the outbreak of war, and it makes him very sort of desperate to, you know, curry favour with Hitler. And so he carries out this absolutely extraordinary mission, takes off from a Messerschmitt 110 in Augsburg and flies to Scotland, obviously, where he parachutes out to land on the land of the Duke of Hamilton, who he thinks is a friend of his. And he says, you know, I'm here to basically, you know, forge a peace deal that, you know, if you allow Nazi Germany to have a free hand in Europe, we'll allow the British Empire and British colonies a free hand, and for Britain to maintain her influence all over the world. And of course, this is just complete nonsense. You know, Churchill by this stage is in no, you know, mood to start listening to what is clearly a semi-deranged individual. And he just remains in prison, you know, locked up until the end of the war, and then he's put on trial at Nuremberg, and by then he's gone mad. He seems very kind of withdrawn, troubled, and he is sentenced at Nuremberg, but he's not sentenced to death, and he actually lives in Spandau prison until his death many decades later as this very kind of cryptic, enigmatic figure.
Yosef Mangalo, also known as the Angel of Death, was a German Schutzstaffel SS officer and physician during World War II. He is mainly remembered for his actions at the Auschwitz concentration camp, where he performed deadly experiments on prisoners. He was a member of the team of doctors who selected victims to be killed in the gas chambers, and was one of the doctors who administered the gas. A doctor, nicknamed the Angel of Death, conducted macabre experiments on the prisoners at the Auschwitz death camp. He started as an SS officer, was sent at the start of World War II to the Eastern Front to repel the Soviets, and received an Iron Cross for his bravery. After being wounded and cleared unfit for active duty, he was assigned to Auschwitz and used prisoners as guinea pigs, particularly women, twins, and the disabled, and tortured and killed children with his medical experiments. After being wounded and cleared unfit for active duty, he was assigned to Auschwitz and used prisoners as guinea pigs, particularly women, twins, and people with disabilities, and tortured and killed children with his medical experiments.
It was Mengele's job to be one of those who selected which prisoners were to go straight to the gas chambers when they arrived by train at Auschwitz, and which prisoners should be allowed to go and work for a few months until they worked themselves, or for a few weeks until they worked themselves to death. But what he also did with his medical hat on was to experiment on twins. He was absolutely fascinated by twins from a kind of anthropological level, from a medical level. And what medics like with twins is that you have two people who are identical, and if you can compare and contrast what happens to them medically. Now, ethically, you can't, in most normal societies, introduce one twin to some disease and the other one not to receive it and then to see how they do. You could do that in Auschwitz because Mengele had all these live human guinea pigs.
But medical experiments took place at a number of the concentration camps across Germany, including Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Natzweiler, and Ravensbrück.
We arrived at Auschwitz, and there was some Jewish people came up the train. He said to us, whatever we do, don't say that we are sick. And we stand in the line, and Mangalo was sitting there, Dr. Mangalo, they called him, and left, right, they announced every young woman should take the baby, give the children to the elderly, to the mothers, to the elderly people. Then when we came in the line, Mangalo, he said on Germany, he talked to us if we are healthy, we are sick, or something is hurting us. He talked so nice, so soft, things.
In my case, never ever talked to me. He talked about me, he talked at me. You have to realize, Mengele did not treat us as human beings. We were just his treasured experiment subjects. We would stand by our bunk beds with our hands behind our back like little soldiers for Mengele's inspection. There was we had 3 supervisors in our barrack, Blockälteste. And one of them would stand at the front and say, Mengele is coming. And everybody would just, it's like some kind of a horror was entering. He would come very elegantly with his hands behind his back. He had a stick in his hand. He would hit it sometime against his riding boots and start counting. He always had at least 6 people with him, many times as many as 8 or 10. It was a big entourage.
He had power of life and death over hundreds of thousands of people, and he committed the most vile experiments on twins and all sorts of other people. And so he knew at the end of the war that he would have to go into hiding because there would be people who had survived Auschwitz who would be giving testimony about his savagery and his barbarism. And what he does, like so many other Nazi figures, he disappears to a farm, and where he ends up working, along with sort of normal farm labourers. But it's clear he's a much more intellectual figure than those around him. They all know that he's, got something to hide. And also what Mengele has is a very wealthy background, because the Mengele family produced farm machinery in southern Germany for decades. And so effectively the family were millionaires. And so when Mengele decides to hot-foot it to Argentina in 1949, he's got the backing of a family fortune to really help smooth his way over there. What's really chilling about Mengele is that throughout the rest of his life, he always would justify what he had done in Auschwitz. He had always thought he had done the morally correct thing. He would see his work on the selection ramps, for starters, saying to people, well, you're going to live and you're going to die. We see that as sending people to their deaths. Mengele saw that as sending people to their continued life, because he had this attitude that everybody there was going to die anyway. So in fact, he was, kind of delaying their deaths. He was being the nice guy. That's absurd. And he also would say that the experiments he did were for the good of humanity, that this was an essential role of medicine, was to experiment on people. It was ultimately beneficial. He would come up with all sorts of kind of pseudo-academic kind of verbiage to kind of justify what he had done. it took a long time for the German people to really come to terms with what had been done in their name. I think a lot of German people throughout the war had more than an inkling, but I don't think they knew the extent of the savagery of what went on, you know, behind those miles upon miles of barbed wire and inside those huts and inside those chambers of death, effectively. And I think that when it was finally revealed to them and when, you know, justice started being done, I think any reasonable German started realizing that actually, yes, there should be some form of retribution. But I think also there was also a feeling, not just in Germany, but also amongst the Allies, that you couldn't spend decade upon decade carrying out tens of thousands of manhunts for all these people. What Nuremberg represents to so many of these Nazis is a real reckoning that they never thought they were going to receive. Maybe some of the smarter ones in the dying days of the war thought maybe, but actually the whole idea of the Reich was not meant to be a 12-year Reich, it was supposed to be a 1,000-year Reich. And in fact, that what was going to happen is that people were going to be treating them as demigods, and statues would be erected and buildings enshrined to them, you know, for hundreds of years, not actually hanging from some grubby rope in the prison courtyard in Nuremberg, which is what happened to them. So they went from kind of being demigods to criminal lowlife very quickly.
The Nuremberg trials represented a very important, unprecedented moment and a way for the Allied powers really to bring to justice some of those key Nazi leaders as representatives of key Nazi organizations who had carried out such unspeakably cruel acts of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against the peace.
It was very radical at the time. There had never been an international criminal court like it. And so this was a kind of coming together of a lot of different legal systems, a lot of different political systems. But what it was saying to the world was, listen, these people who commit war crimes, these people who commit genocide, these people who commit crimes against humanity, they are never, ever going to get away with it ever again.